Well, hello and welcome to today's episode of the Freight Insider Podcast, where we are opening the door to the business of freight. I am your host, Paige Siplon. I always say that freight is the common denominator of this complicated math problem that we call our economy. Every business is touched by freight, but the how varies greatly, and how it happens matters even more. Some companies exist to move the freight from one point to another. Other technology companies track it. Some manufacture or create freight. Others still rely on receiving freight, to then share it with consumers and other businesses who then consume it. Freight is complicated. Freight is sort of all purpose, and it's exciting. And frankly, a pretty well-kept secret to a lot of businesses and frankly to the American public in general. Today, I have a really special guest joining me, an old friend of mine. We've done a lot of things together, served on a variety of committees together over the years. Started his career with Nabisco, working his way up to vice president supply chain. My guest became the vice president of supply chain for Kraft, later joined ConAgra Foods as senior vice president of integrated logistics. His expertise in furthering supply chain management programs and initiatives led my guest to become president and chief executive officer of the well-known, probably more by its acronym than its full name, the Council of Supply Chain Management Professionals, or affectionately known as CSCMP, where he retired last year after many years at the helm. My guest was also designated by the U.S. Department of Commerce to serve as the chair of the Advisory Committee of Supply Chain Competitiveness, where he provides counsel from a business perspective, importantly, to issues that are affecting supply chain sector and what the government can do about it. He currently serves on this committee, as well as being a member of the Northwestern University's Transportation Center Business Advisory Committee and past chair of the Grocery Manufacturers Association Logistics Committee. Rick, I don't think they come up with shorter names for our association things we're part of.
The longer the better, it seems, right?
It seems like it, yeah. And he was also the past president of WORK, also a group known by its acronym, the Warehousing Education and Research Council, another important association out there. So today, my guest is Mr. Rick Blasgen. Thanks for coming. Welcome to the Freight Insider, Rick.
My pleasure, Paige. Thanks for doing this for all of us in the discipline.
Yeah, it seems long overdue. Wish we had gotten together sooner. We were just talking before we started that sorry we can't do this in person, but it feels like we're getting closer to being able to do more in-person stuff. Hopefully to see you at the CSCMP conference in Tennessee coming up soon. So, well, I just walked through your background, Rick, and it's intense, right? And you've been around and done a lot of different things for a lot of great, very well-known companies and very well-known associations. But it's always interesting, the whole freight journey that you've been on through your life. Tell me a little bit about how that started and what was your first sort of foray into falling in love with logistics?
Well, interestingly, and thanks for that. It's funny, I do a lot of speaking at schools and so on, and every now and then students will say, how do you navigate your career? And you sort of chuckle and you say, it navigates you in a lot of respects, but we'll talk about that later. But through high school, I was playing in a band and working at my dad's pizza places and so on, and then I got a job at Sears. And interestingly, I was in the shipping and receiving department, and learned about how products come into a store and go out and how you mark them and bring them out to the departments and so on. And graduated from college. It was much like a recession, like we've recently had, and ended up getting a job offer at a finance major and thought I was going to, go to the Chicago Mercantile Exchange or something. Ended up getting a job from Nabisco as an inventory analyst. And I said, well, I'll go put the white cream in Oreos for a few years or whatever. And whatever I'm supposed to do. Well, that led to order processing. And then I was a supervisor at a Teamsters union, nicknamed College Kid, where the employees told me they've had their jobs longer than I've been alive, which was interesting.
That's right.
You learn a lot about workforce management, but all of those experiences were great. And that's before the word logistics was even born. And next thing you know, distribution became logistics, and companies started thinking about manufacturing and distribution, learning what each other does and how the inventory flows horizontally from one supply chain partner to the next. And there's these people called, trucks in the middle and trains in the middle, and nobody ever talked to them, and might be important to include them in some decisions and so on. So, we fast forward and a career just sort of continues to go on, and I enjoyed it. Became a little more responsible for bigger organizations here and there. And I went to Chesapeake, Virginia to run a distribution center, and then Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania to be a regional manager, including inventory management, and then into New Jersey, where Nabisco is headquartered. And back in the day, I lived through the RJR acquisition of Nabisco and then the KKR leverage buyout of RJR.
Hmm.
And then Philip Morris owned Kraft, bought Nabisco, smashed us together. And then they asked me to come back out to Chicago, where I'm from, and began to lead Kraft's North American supply chain. So, all those sort of things just happened, and it wasn't like, go think about this. Back in the day, it was boom, boom, boom. Things just happened, and you picked up and you moved, and it all worked out okay.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I never really thought about it, and I've known about your past, but a lot of food related things and
Yes.
food related experiences was that. I mean, obviously, when you carve a niche, not necessarily you carve the niche sort of carved you, to use your phrase.
Yeah.
Was that intentional, or I'm just curious?
It wasn't really intentional, but I really enjoyed it, and I was getting increased levels of responsibility, and the companies were buying and selling different brands. And back
Right.
then, you may recall, there was a small retailer in Bentonville, Arkansas, that decided to sell food.
I've heard of them. Yeah.
Yeah.
They just bought a football team.
Got into that, changed a lot, and so companies began to consolidate. And so I remember recruiters used to call me, my gosh, you've been with Nabisco for 12 years or 14 years. Why don't you leave? I'm like, well, why should I do that? They like me, I like them. I'm getting increased responsibility and learning a hell of a lot.
Sure.
And seeming to have an impact. So I just stuck it out, and things just fell into place that way.
Yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating, that journey. Again, that's what this podcast is all about, hearing about where you've been and how you got there. So that kind of brings us to where you're at now, in your journey, and your journey is far from over. I would add, you mentioned sort of in passing that you played the guitar as a kid. You joked with me the other day. You're just frustrated and don't understand why the Doobie Brothers haven't called you up to be a. Oh, great! So this is the part where you play us a few bars, and
here we do a little China Grove or something.
Yeah, go for it, Rick. Nice.
I don't know why they're not calling.
That's a first for the podcast. We've got a Rick Blasgen original. We'll forward that on to the Doobie Brothers and make sure they call you this time. I don't know why they haven't called you either. So beyond being an accomplished guitarist, which you certainly are, being able to just rip one out right there, you're still working with CSCMP, obviously. Yeah. I'm glad you're doing that. Your leadership has really transformed that organization. I was part of it here in Atlanta, and certainly been part of the annual conferences over many years, and also the Supply Chain Council. What are some of the things you're excited about doing with those two groups in particular over the next few years or the next few days?
Well, so a couple things. I joined CSCMP back in 2005. I had a few years with ConAgra, and we moved everything into Omaha, and I wasn't going to relocate to Omaha. So I ended up joining CSCMP, and I always had a passion for the discipline. I always had a passion for industry allowing their executives to go help an association build something for the betterment of the overall industry, like efficient consumer response, or some of those auto ID initiatives that came out of MIT and other organizations. Right. And so I felt the discipline has a role in advancing the logistics and supply chain world and the careers of the individuals in it. So we would say we connect, develop, and educate the world's supply chain professionals, and meant it. I mean, it was a professional association, is a professional association, not a trade association. So, we still care about that. So, we began to do a lot of unbiased research, and here's what's going on, and here's how you learn more, and here's how you advance your career. And mentors were readily available. Senior supply chain people love to help coach people through their careers.
They do. You're right.
People would ask me, well, how do I go up to Paige Siplon? I said, well, why don't you go up to Paige Siplon, extend your hand? That's called a handshake.
Right.
Look him in the eye and say, hey, how you doing? I always wanted to meet you. He will talk with you.
Right.
And so it was an organization, Paige, as you well know, that brought people together from all walks of supply chain life. It was a global organization, and it was just very, very fulfilling to try to help advance logistics and supply chain while doing good for the people in it. And then one of my pet peeves is, how do we drive it as a destination career earlier in somebody's education? You don't hear about it in grade school or high school. Right. Now you do. There's supply chain all over the place, right?
Still got a long ways to go there, but we'll talk about that.
Yeah, and a lot of times it's used and people don't know what they're really mentioning, but at least the term is out there now. And now we've got a job to educate people even more about the careers and what it really does.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, I mean, that communication and just getting out in front of individuals, it's always struck me. And CSCMP is a very unique group, focused on the individual, which you said it's for the professional, it's for the trade, but driven by, because it's a people business. Guest yesterday I had from Roadrunner, where we were talking about that we are in a people business. And I think CSCMP is a great example of helping to promote and drive the professionalism of the individuals that make up our industry. So
exactly. And, and I learned through that in the food industry too, that we used to focus a lot on forecasting because we did not know, who was going to eat what, when, and how. And
sure.
I recall I spent a lot of time on demand forecasting, supply forecasting, and all that. And then I got to thinking later on in your career, if we do all of this right and the truck doesn't show up, none of it matters. And that's where I sort of started getting into transportation, as it's not infinite and it is a very key service link to everything we do. And we better focus on collaborating with transportation partners and having them be part of our overall supply chain plan very early on. And I recall one of our transportation directors used to say, everybody talks about being a preferred shipper. We better be a preferred carrier. We want a preferred carrier to think of us as a preferred shipper so that they work with us, because there will at some point be shortages and freight is not infinite and so on. So early on, I became very cognizant of how important that is. in 2011, I was asked to chair that. And I said, well, why me? And they said, well, the council is an unbiased group. You care about this. It's not like you're, from the trucking association where the railroads are evil or
soybean council, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I said, okay. So our job was to explain through the Department of Commerce, the Secretary of Commerce, Penny Pritzker was the first one at the time for this committee, what the country needs to do and should do in order to retain and improve its competitiveness on the global stage. And so it wasn't about, let's just go find funding. It was, hey, we need to improve our ports efficiencies. We need to improve the connectors to the ports. We have to do something about how we fund infrastructure and, how we have a marketing plan on supply chain and why it's an important role to play for the next generation coming up. And so we did a lot of work on import-export. I found out that when a product comes in to be consumed in the United States, there's no less than 47 agencies that have to approve it. And I didn't even know there were 47 agencies that exist. So we sent people over to Singapore because we know that they do it very well and products come in and it's all very automated. And we learned a lot from that and brought some of those suggestions into the Department of Commerce. And the Department of Commerce then works with the other agencies, including the White House, to recommend these things. And we're still making those recommendations today.
That's great.
It's an important role for the industry leaders to get involved with and explain to government the role they can have.
Yeah, that's key, I think, Rick, and what you're doing, and I'm glad you're part of that still, is that interaction between government and industry. Certainly in supply chain and logistics, it's what near and dear to our hearts. But I would say that maybe can be a role model and be extended across a lot of different issues that our country is facing. They need to listen to the experts. They need to listen to the Rick Blasgens of the world to really get a feel, because if they come out of just the government perspective, an important perspective, but the rubber hits the road outside of the White House. The rubber hits the road outside of the halls of the Department of Commerce. And they've got to get that perspective. And I just feel like it doesn't happen often enough. That should be a entry point for every issue that government is working on, is having the Rick Blasgens of the world and those councils created.
And one of the things I used to tell the committee is, look, we have to transcend administrations. When we first started, Penny Pritzker was the Secretary of Commerce, and then Wilbur Ross, and now Gina Raimondo. And they may have different perspectives, maybe from different parties, but we have to form this as an area that government can improve upon and should improve upon if we do care about our retention and ability to improve our competitiveness. And so that's the angle we came from. I used to call it, look, let's propose the elegant solution and not just stop at an area because we think there's no funding for it or no political aspiration for it. Yeah. So it's still going on that way, and there's a lot of great things that came out of it. A lot of things being kicked around, and we'll need some funding and so on. But it's been a good effort.
Yeah, well, thank you for doing that for all of us in our industry and for the country, because it's so critical. Speaking of sort of a national perspective, we were joking before, we can't do this in person and haven't done it enough. I guess we could do it in person now, but the pandemic has certainly caused a lot of disruptions in our own personal lives, and certainly in the world of freight. Really changed the way freight moves in a lot of ways. and certainly in the way that us as consumers digest it, pun intended, and consume it. What challenges do you think are still lingering out there that are, sort of front of your mind, and this ways companies can compete and keep up with?
Well, one interesting thing I thought about is the pandemic hits, and I guess if you're there, you could say, "Hey, Paige, go get the book off the shelf that says how you deal with your supply chain during a pandemic."
Right.
And you'd go over to the bookshelf and you wouldn't find one. So I think that it taught us, if you remember early on, truck drivers needed to be isolated. They needed to go into an area, and I thought to myself, we've never treated truck drivers the way we should. They're an important part of our business, but nevertheless, it's a pandemic. We want to continue to move important freight across our network. We got to figure out how to keep people safe, and we didn't know a lot in the early days of this thing. I was kidding around yesterday. I said, remember 15 days to slow the spread. That turned into 3 years, and so, you kind of got to look at this and say, all right, we have a intrinsic need to continue to move freight, and somebody's got to do that. So how do we do it, and how do we understand it to be safe and to be efficient and effective? And somehow we changed our ways of operating at the points where truckers met the receivers and so on, and figured out new things and new ways to do it. So I think as a discipline, I've always felt the supply chain discipline itself is pretty agile and flexible, and yes, resilient and all of those words, but it figures things out quickly, because inventory at rest does nobody any good. So how do I move it along? And I think particularly in the transportation industry, they did a pretty good job of adjusting to all of this. Well, we were figuring out how do we stay home and still make stuff and move it.
Right. We have to, right? I mean, people from the food industry, people got to eat and people get sick, right? And not from a pandemic perspective, but medicine and food. I mean, it's still got to flow. And we've certainly seen it from toilet paper to now baby food to pick your product. It seems to be a challenge.
Well, it's funny you mentioned toilet paper. I don't know how many times I was interviewed about that early on, and I'm like, we shut down the government, we shut down schools, we shut down everything. The toilet paper that's consumed in
schools, that's the bar. You can't. That's too far, right?
Yeah, it's completely different toilet paper than what we're buying off. All those people are now buying 4-ply Charmin and Northern toilet paper, and so the machines that run all this stuff have to change from 1-ply to it just takes a while.
Yeah, it's a great point. Yeah, I mean, to that point, I mean, we walked in the grocery stores after rewinding a bit, after we were actually able to go into grocery stores again, and we saw that the shelves were empty, and for things that we were critically dependent on, like toilet paper. And I think, and I know you believe this too, and I'm an optimist just like you, glass for a full guy, almost to a flaw sometimes. But, I always thought, hey, it's a pain that I can't get my toilet paper, but people are going to realize the importance of supply chain more than they ever have, right? They got to know that the milk just didn't magically show up on the shelf overnight. It was brought there by a truck driver. And we started seeing stories about that, calling them, frontline workers, and states designating them appropriately, I think, as well as nurses and first responders, which are obviously critical too. But to have that in the conversation, I think will pay dividends for years.
Well, when I'm at a party in the neighborhood or something, somebody says, "What do you do?" I work in supply chain, and they'll say, "What's that?" Well, when's the last time you were at a store?
Right.
Well, 2 weeks ago. When you bought that item, where do you think it came from? Well, it came from the back room. Right. That's about where they're
the magical back room, right?
Magical back room. Well, how did it get to the back room? And they're like, I don't know. And how did somebody decide what to put that there? All those kind of questions, and you lead them down a path where they finally understand that this is not magic. It's real life physical movement.
And then they experience it firsthand when they go to the grocery store. And
right.
And I think that it will improve the support we as an industry, logistics, trucking in particular, get from other business sectors. I think other businesses realize it. Manufacturers, understand that chain of supply chain, some more than others. So you talked about shipper of choice, receiver of choice. Hopefully this drives it home. What are your thoughts? Do you think that will help? Or?
Well, it will. It will, I think. And also, once you get into the numbers, we've been producing the state of logistics report for decades now.
That's right. Yeah.
One of the things I have charts on is it's always, transportation, trucking transportation is a big part of it, but transportation overall is about 67, 68% of the logistics spend. which is, 1.6, $1.7 trillion or 7.5% of GDP. So think about that. One mode of transportation is 67% in this country. And it's not like that's going to change because it's a geographically big country. If you took Europe, the continent of Europe, and overlaid it over the US, it's about a third of the size with double the people. So it's a different transportation system. It's very close in. There's a high density of people in certain areas in certain countries and so on. So, that notion alone says I've got to focus on transportation, and along with fuel, obviously, and truckers, and how do we, treat that position as a much more professional position. And yes, we should pay more for it, but companies have figured out how to make it more efficient, and we still move freight in the toughest of times. And I think we just take it for granted. As I often said, you've heard me say this a million times, supply chain is like the wire between the switch and the light. You flip the switch, the light goes on. You don't call your power company up and thank them. You call them up when it doesn't go on. Well,
that's
when
right.
do we get called? When something doesn't show up right.
Yep, it's a firefight for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, as far as getting younger people into the mix, statistics, right? I mean, in the trucking industry, the average age is 50 something years old and growing in age. And, we've long, and that's a decades old problem. How do we encourage younger folks to get into our industry broadly, freight, supply chain, logistics, any of the big words used to describe them. Trucking in particular is certainly near to my heart and yours as well. But how do we bring, or how do we, beyond the work that CSCMP is doing to get young folks involved, maybe talk a little bit about that, but how do we get younger folks? I'm sure there's some silver bullet that we've been missing, right, to get involved in our industry.
Well, I don't know, Paige. If there was, I would hope that we would have found it by now. But
yeah,
I think it's just a continual sort of marketing plan. I think we're much better at keeping truck drivers home more frequently, getting them home more frequently. The days of I leave and come back 3 weeks from now, for the most part.
That still happens, but yeah.
It still happens. But we get people to take a truck from St. Louis to wherever, and they get a backhaul back to St. Louis so that they're home more frequently. And I think trucking companies have done a pretty good job with data, with systems and things, and routing data to figure out how to do that. And then modes, the top 10 intermodal customers of some railroad are usually truckers, truck driving companies. And so there is this collaboration that does go on behind the scenes. But I think we have to employ our folks coming up that this isn't a job that has any sort of connotation to it other than it's professional, performs a unique service, and it can be a great life for somebody who wants to go see the country for a while. And,
right.
I think we treat them better at receivers. You used to hear these stories in the food industry. Somebody goes to some distribution center and the truck driver's held up there for 8 hours because they're 10 minutes late or something.
Yeah.
I think companies have figured out that's not a way to run a business. So I think there is this notion of, hey, we got to treat each other with respect, and let's get that inventory moving along where it can do some good. I think it's much better than it was.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, it's difficult to get young folks in there. I think technology plays a big role. I have a 17 and a 21-year-old, and email is not even on their technology spectrum. It's text and Snapchat and TikTok, and not just to watch funny videos of cats. I mean, they're using it. They'll be able to use it more in a business perspective, as a lot of businesses are starting to do. So that immediate communication, and they go to a trucking company, make something up, and they hand them paper logs. They're like, no, I'm not doing that. That doesn't happen anymore. Although some places it does. So we've got to be able to embrace technology and then, like you said, communicate with them about what technology plays a role. And those jobs are going to change, to your point, and getting those folks, marketing and communicating it has always been, I think, a struggle for us, being able to get folks understanding what supply chain and logistics has to offer.
Well, and you can have a career. I mean, I think that, maybe there's a way for, look, I'm a truck driver for 5 years and then I go into some other area of distribution. Maybe I run a distribution center because I now understand how that runs, or, I get into some other aspect of it. I think too often we bucket people into these jobs and say, well, that's your career forever. And I don't necessarily think, that's true any longer.
That's a great point. I mean, there's definitely maybe more than, bias, right? But maybe more than most industries, there is definitely a pathway. CSCMP has got ways to get trained and certified to follow that pathway, right? To be a supply chain professional. We had Frank Hurst that we were talking before about, from president of Roadrunner. He talked about his first job being a forklift driver. Well, he's now head of a multi-million dollar company. And he started as a forklift operator. Look at all the CEOs and presidents of UPS started as delivery drivers. That's an intentional pathway. And I think there's lots of maybe smaller examples of that, of how people can start off doing something, not even entry level, but critical, but as a first step, and then be able to take that pathway with some guidance and help with mentors and organizations like CSCMP.
Right. That's right. I mean, and we've got to educate folks. Your career is a journey. It's not a sprint.
Yeah.
People ask me all the time, well, how did you do this? Look, I didn't know. Somebody was smart enough to tell me, go work in a distribution center because you're going to learn things you can't learn, on a phone or whatever. So I went and did it, and
right.
What happens when you're running a distribution center, for example, in Pennsylvania for the first day of deer hunting season? People don't show up. So just pre-ship everything the weekend before and let them go out and hunt. Tuesday, they'll be back and be happy. And there's just things like that go on. Or, at Kraft, we used to store coffee down in the Louisiana area and so on. And during hurricane season, we began to reposition inventory out of the paths of hurricane because, we were trying to save the inventory because we knew it was going to happen. Well, maybe that was the early days of risk mitigation and resilience. Who knows? We didn't call it that. We just said, move inventory out of the path of a hurricane.
Sounds simple to say when you think about it that way, right?
Yeah.
That's a great.
It's such a great dynamic field with so many different jobs in it.
Yeah.
So and we got to get that message across.
Continue to, yeah, for sure. Well, you've done a great job of doing it so far, and glad you're continuing to work on it with folks like us. So, sort of taking that a step further, looking to the future, we talked a lot about, what would you, I always like to look back, if you could go back to the Rick Blasgen, just starting off his career, starting those first classes, getting ready to go work at Sears, what advice would you give yourself looking back, and then maybe translate that into what advice would you give to our next generation of youth coming into our industry?
It's a great question. I'm glad you posed it. I would have went back and said, don't be afraid about thinking about the qualities you have as an individual and then translating that into a role. And someone who has been there before that will see that, and you got to trust someone, and they're going to allow you to go expand on that. So, I was pretty outgoing because I was an entertainer, was in a band and screwing around on stage and stuff. So, that translated into pretty good interpersonal characteristics where I would be free to talk to someone who is on a dock floor and then later on to a Wall Street analyst or a CEO and learn to convert your language to the audience that you're trying to influence. So I think that if you just think about your managerial, technical, and leadership capabilities throughout your career, there is no job you're ever going to go into where you're not going to learn something. Go learn that. Go work on the second shift in a manufacturing facility, or go work on a truck driver, trucker's yard somewhere, and find out what really goes on. You're seeing it in numbers and screens and things, but there's a truck somewhere with a flat tire, and it's gonna, got to get fixed and it's got to get moving. Go figure that out.
Right.
And I don't think if I've had those experiences, I would have been prepared to be somewhat successful in my career later on, understanding what goes on in the physical supply chain. And then as you get more senior, you learn more about the dynamics of marketing and manufacturing and how to bring people together. And collaboration is alive and well. And, you got to understand, I remember early on, the manufacturing person would say, if the sales organization would just sell what we're making, everything would be fine. And they meant it, that was their goal. Well, it's not that way. And so many things you can learn throughout your career. Just don't be afraid of taking those chances and those risks. Most good companies won't let you fail. And so you'll figure that out and you'll learn and you'll look back and go, that experience that I had back there, which I thought, what am I doing this for? I would have never been successful had I not had that experience. That's
a great point. Yeah. I mean, that seems to really be a trend for the folks we've talked to, leaders like you, is mentorship, communication, trust yourself. And it's a layered approach, and don't be afraid to get out there and really reach out and learn from folks around you. And supply chain, I think, really lends itself to doing that. Well, Rick, this has been a great conversation. I know you and I could love to listen to some more guitar and be able to chat some more. Hopefully you'll be able to see you in Tennessee at the next CSCMP conference.
I'll be there
soon.
I'll be there.
Well, I appreciate you being with us, Rick. On behalf of the Freight Insider Podcast, all our listeners, how can folks find out more about you and connect with you if they want to chat with you more? Maybe ask you to be a mentor or ask for some advice.
Absolutely. I'm on LinkedIn all the time.
Okay.
So you just type my name in on LinkedIn. I'll provide you my email address, and I love to connect with people and still enjoy the discipline. I'm still doing some work for CSCMP and the committee, as you mentioned, and some other companies I've stayed close with. So I want to be active, Paige, and want to have an impact wherever I can. So if it's helping people, I'll be glad to do that.
Well, we need you to be. So thank you for doing that. We'll put all for the listeners. We'll put all the links for Rick and contact information in the description here of the podcast and the video. So again, thank you, Rick, for being with us on behalf of the Freight Insider Podcast. And for all of our listeners, don't forget to enjoy your own personal freight journey. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.